Hello, and welcome to the Feet on the Soil podcast, the podcast about the world beneath our feet and how we interact with it. If you know me in real life, you probably know I love to be outdoors. Out on hillsides or sitting down in forests is where I find myself at my happiest. I'll examine each plant that I pass by and stop to try and identify a flapping bird overhead. The mountains especially are where I feel most at home. Something about the expanse and the feeling of being engulfed in something much larger than myself makes me feel something that no other place can compare to. And when I'm not in the hills, I love the smell of trees all around me, the sound of a stream's gentle descent over a rock, and the back and forth whistle of songbirds overhead. In an ideal world, I could spend all my time in places like this, but sometimes I have to venture out to a much more concrete place, full of unfamiliar grey blocks and immense noise masking the bird sound. That means I have to go into the city. Now, for all the complaining that I do about it, I don't hate Dublin city centre, and I spent a lot of my time there as a teenager, skateboarding, shopping and just messing around. But I never felt comfortable there. But not long ago, while wandering down a side street on my way into work, I stopped for a sec and noticed something at my feet. Coming out of the ground in a last-ditch effort to grab some sunlight was a small plant. It had pale blue petals and soft curling leaves, and must have seeded there from someone's balcony garden. Amongst the grey paving and speeding cars, it was like a tiny little forest, all in itself. And I found myself getting just a bit of that feeling I get when I'm out in the woods. A little bit of the curiosity, that calm, and I wanted to see more. As I continued down, I began to notice that all around me were these little micro-habitats, gaps in walls and paths where nature was making an attempt to crawl its way back. Patches of dandelions, cleavers and moss clung to wall and floor, and insects buzzed and crawled all around them. All of a sudden, it became clear how thick I'd been in the last few years. Just because I'm in town doesn't mean I'm apart from nature. I just have to use a bit more imagination. The plant life that I see on the mountains or in the forests is still all around me. It's still calling for my attention, and I've just been ignoring it. But these plants, for some reason, have garnered a different name. They're not wildflowers or ornamentals or micro-habitats. They are weeds, and their sole purpose is to be pulled from the cracks they grow in, or power hosed off the walls they cling to. And in my head, that just seems a little bit unfair. Now, I'm not saying every path and wall should be an overgrown jungle just for my benefit, but if I'm playing devil's advocate, the plants were there in first, in all fairness. So why have these plants lost their Irish names, their scientific names, and even their common names, and all of a sudden become just weeds? Well, in this week's episode of the Feet on the Soil podcast, we'll be exploring how these plants not only deserve to be there, but how their very existence can improve our towns and our lives, while also taking a closer look at some of these species, so hopefully you can notice a few of these and care about them as something more than just a weed. We're all fairly familiar with the term weed, and we probably throw it around fairly commonly in daily use, but the word originally comes from an old English word, weod, I think I'm pronouncing it right, which refers to a plant that makes blue dye, which doesn't really link to what they are now, but the word over time came to encompass all plants that were viewed as undesirable. But what makes a plant undesirable? It's completely subjective. I have a little meadow at the bottom of my garden, and some saplings of cherry trees have come up. These would be considered a weed in my meadow. I don't particularly want them there because I want it for wildflowers and wild grasses, but in an orchard, these cherry saplings are a good thing, and my wildflowers and wild grasses are, quote-unquote, the weed. The idea of weeds has come from a long history of gardening, and that concept being linked with colonial mindsets. English gardens, French gardens, Italian gardens, these sort of ornamental person-first gardens first put forward this idea of a weed, something that shouldn't be there. And through meticulous culling, these weeds are removed from a garden to make something that is aesthetically perfect. But But how could a plant be undesirable? Even though a nettle stings, it's still an essential part of the life cycle of many insects, especially butterflies who use its leaves as protection and foodstuffs when they're little caterpillars roaming around. It's become quite common now for people to change their mind on weeds. A lot of the rewilding movement has a part to play in this, as people begin to realise that just allowing nature to thrive means that all plants are essentially equal. We don't have things in a hierarchy. It's not like the oak holds a huge place above a dandelion. Each one feeds into the other. And when walking around an urban area, pretty much any plant, unless it's in a plant pot, is a weed. But like I saw on my little walk down to work, these plants still hold a very valuable position. When I worked as a gardener, I spent most of my time pulling up weeds and thinking about weeds and being able to spot them on any walk as something that messes up a garden corner. But now as I look around, each one of these plants are incredibly important, whether this be for the pollinators, for insects as little hideouts, or even just for the pure enjoyment of seeing a flower in an urban space. And what became increasingly clear to me as I kind of progressed as a gardener, but also became more involved in environmental causes and ecology in general, was that most of the time these weeds were the things that held a lot of cultural and historical background. They were plants that were used as foodstuff way back in time. They were used for dyeing clothes, as the name of the weeds comes from, and they were used as medicines. So it's kind of incredible that these plants, which were once one of the most important things, seen as lifesavers, have now become something that are just a kind of a nuisance, something that we have to, as I said, pull from the ground or power wash from the walls. And if you're someone who enjoys a weekend hike on your break from work, but then when you come into the city, you get a bit annoyed when you have to walk down an alleyway that's a bit overgrown, or when your garden has a few dandelions growing in the lawn, you get a lawnmower out to chop the heads off them. I think this is something that we really have to reframe our minds on. It's all well and good to have corners that are protected for wildlife, but we need more than that. We need an entire world which is protected for wildlife. Dandelions should be allowed to grow, nettles should be allowed to thrive, chickweed should be allowed to spread, moss should be allowed to cling to walls. All of these things are not important just for the aesthetic value, not just for the value that they serve to other creatures like insects, but even just for the intrinsic value of their existence. And I know for certain people it can be a bit hard to wrap your head around the fact that weeds are actually a good thing, which is why I want to kind of delve into a few of the weeds that we see commonly, a few of these wildflowers, and kind of have a look at both their history and then their uses to try and give you a bit of extra appreciation for them. And maybe even on your next walk, you'll be able to spot one and just enjoy its company for a little bit. The first flower or weed that I want to start with is the nettle. I've talked about it before, and it seems to be one of the flowers with the best sort of PR team behind it, as it went from something that was just annoying when your football got stuck in it to something that people really seem to value now, and they see the kind of importance of it. Nettle has long been used medicinally. I think a lot of people now will know that a sting from a stinging nettle can help reducing seasonal allergies or hay fever. It can also be used for urinary issues, but one thing that it's kind of prolific for is its use as a foodstuff. My granddad used to make nettle soup, and it was kind of a food that was easy to access as it grew essentially everywhere, but it was super high in all sorts of different beneficial substances, things like calcium and other minerals, and was something that helped people to survive in harder times. Nettles also have a long history in use for dyeing clothes. We think that they've been used at least as far back as the Bronze Age, and when used they give a kind of a neutral brown, kind of a light green, a very earth tone colour. So it can be assumed that the reason it was used to create a camouflage, to blend in with your environment. And I mean, what better way to blend in with your environment than to use your environment? This is a kind of hint as to how weeds got their name, that sort of dyeing blue. Plant dyes have been used for centuries, and nettles are just one example of that. But it's not only the human uses, of course. Like I mentioned, nettles are incredibly important to pollinators and especially to butterflies in their life cycles. And speaking of birds, they will also use the dense stinging protection of the foliage to their advantage. They can, nibble on a few of the caterpillars that they see around them, but ground nesting birds and songbirds will defend themselves from predators by taking shelter in the leaves of the nettles. And if you want to spot nettles on your next walk around town, it's quite easy. They grow pretty much everywhere in Ireland, and their kind of triangular serrated leaves are quite easy to spot. If you ever have any issues identifying them, simply touch the leaf and enjoy the stinging sensation that comes with it. Towards the autumn, which we find ourselves in now, you can also identify them from the big plumes of seeds that come out of them. They're a bit of a brown colour, and as far as I know, I think you can eat them like a grain, but don't quote me on that. Another weed that you can look out for is chickweed. Chickweed is a much, much smaller weed. It kind of spreads out along the ground, and it has some lovely tiny white flowers on its little leaves. And it's a plant that I have personal experience with. It's long been used for skin irritations, and all my life I've suffered with eczema. And I believe I might have tried every cream out there to try and sort out my eczema. And it wasn't until about a year ago when I tried a chickweed balm from forager.ie, from Phoebe, who's been on the podcast before. As soon as I put it on, it's quite cooling. That's one of its benefits. And not that it's completely healed my eczema, I wouldn't make that claim. But whenever it gets quite bad, whenever I have flare-ups, it immediately soothes down the skin irritation. And this isn't something that just came with modern medical research. This is something that's been used for at least decades, probably centuries, and it's a plant that just grows all around us. The plant has also long been used in teas to kind of help with digestion or to help with inflammation, and again, these are kind of the more human-centered uses. It's also a fantastic plant for pollinators because those little white flowers I was talking about are on the plant year-round. So in the depths of winters, when plants are few and far between and pollinators need a little bit of food, it's the chickweed that looks after them. Another advantage of them is that they are a great colonizer plant. They'll take over patches of bare earth and they'll cover it fairly quick, which protects against soil erosion, it protects against nutrient loss, and all in all, it's a plant that, like I was saying about the small blue petaled plant that I saw on the street in town, it kind of takes back before other plants can take over. One of my favourite plants to spot on a walk around town is ivy. It's something that has been kind of taken over and used as a decorative plant, so its status as a weed is a bit in the air, but ivy is an incredible plant. I had a friend who was incredibly passionate about ivy. You might have heard the episode with him. Adam is his name, and he kind of got me on the ivy train. I was always a fan of it, but when you work as a gardener and you spend days and days and days pulling ivy off trees and buildings, you begin to kind of hate it when you see it. But once I heard the list of benefits that come with it, I was fairly sold. Its dense foliage and vines serve as a great place for bats to roost or for small mammals to hide away, and even birds, and its berries are kind of the main selling point. It's got these flowers that are incredibly high in pollen, so again, mentioning our pollinators, it helps them out a huge amount. But once we get into the kind of late autumn and into the winter, you'll see the big kind of round dark berries on the ivy. They kind of come up like plumes of foliage first as these little umbrella looking flowers, and eventually turn into these dark marble like balls. These are great for birds, and they're great for anything that can snack on the berries that they produce. Ivy also has a medicinal history. It's long been used to help with issues of the throat or the respiratory system, which I probably need at the moment, as you can probably hear I'm a bit raspy. I've got a bit of a cold on me. And the Greeks and Romans even believed that by applying the ground up leaves it could prevent wounds on the body. It's also, in my opinion, quite a pretty plant. When you're out walking and everything around you is just red brick and concrete, seeing ivy spreading up a building kind of reminds you that nature is always there. And now that you know a few of the weeds, I'm sure you can look up some photos or find your nearest bookshop and buy a plant identification book to try and learn better how to spot these plants in the wild. How can you better appreciate just the general wilds of the city, the nature that's around you? It can be easy to walk around a city and completely forget that somewhere else the buildings are replaced by towering trees, the pathways taken by wet soils, and the cars replaced by rushing deer and shy squirrels. But it's not impossible to still appreciate nature while you're in these places. One of my favourite little escapes when I was working in town was to get to a local park. I can't really spend that much time in the city, and when I do, I like to kind of break it up with little patches of nature. So I used to go to any of the small parks. A church is always a good find. They usually have a nice little ancient tree with a bench underneath it. So if in doubt, find a church steeple. But when you're in there, don't just walk through it as a kind of a place to be. Really take it all in. I like to sit on a bench, or ideally on the ground if it hasn't been raining, and just notice what's around me. I start with the kind of space around my hands, seeing if there's any weeds, quote unquote, within the grass, if I can spot any of that chickweed, any dandelions, any daisies, any dock, hopefully not any nettles because I still want to be comfortable. And then I'll adjust my vision up further, hopefully see some shrubs around me, maybe even some of that ivy, before eventually turning my vision up to the sky and seeing any trees around me. If you're in a graveyard, you're probably going to see a few yew trees. If you're in one of the city parks, chances are you might see a beech or an evergreen oak. And if you're in a slightly bigger park, maybe you're in the Phoenix Park or something like that, you might be lucky enough to even see a nice stand of native broadleaf forestry. I think practices like this are important just to kind of keep yourself centered, keep yourself aware, but also it allows us to kind of see a different vision of the city. In environmental circles, we can really focus on the rural. We want our national parks to be perfect. We want our farming to be sustainable, and we want our rivers as clean as possible. All of these are incredibly important and very honourable pursuits, but I think it's important to not forget that while our rural areas should be filled with nature and should be beautiful, so should our cities. And by stopping in a park and seeing a mature tree contrasted against a large building, it starts to get your mind working in different ways. You start to kind of think about how nature could be incorporated in the city. And even just hearing a bit of bird song in the middle of a bustling street can kind of wake you up to something. You also might start to see more life than you think. While looking up at the trees, you might see some squirrels jumping from branch to branch. While looking at your hands in the grass, you might see some beetles crawling over it. You might see a ladybird resting on the top of a blade of grass. And while looking at the shrubbery, you might just see a fox in the evening. This is something I really needed. I used to hate the city because I thought that there was really nothing there for me. But the harder I looked, the more I was able to see that there's still stuff there that's worth protecting, and there's still stuff there that you can kind of envisage a greener future for. Another thing to do is just to notice those small plants. I think when you're aware of it, you'll be blown away by the amount of stuff that you pass just on a daily walk. A lot of it is going to be your more common things, your dandelions, your buttercups, the kind of browny green moss that seems to cover every wall in Dublin. But as you're looking, you might start to notice something else. You might see some buddleia poking out of a construction site that's covered in the odd monarch butterfly. You might take a wander down a greenway and spot a stand of ash trees like I did just up by Croke Park, which is a bit of a surprise. And of course, you hear stories about the really rare stuff. If you listen to my episode of the How to Be Irish podcast, the host was telling me about an encounter that she had with a pine marten in her house in suburban Dublin. So you never know what you're going to see. And when you start to take notice of these plants, take a slightly deeper notice. Don't just see the plant, take it for what it is and move on. There's plenty of websites out there that you can learn a lot more about the plant. The thing that I'm very interested in at the moment is how these plants were viewed in Irish mythology. And so what I'll usually do is either know the plant's name in my head or use the Picture This app, which lets you just take a picture and identify a plant, get the plant name and just look up its name and Irish mythology. From there you can go down the rabbit hole of learning the different myths and legends associated with it. Or it could be something else that interests you. You might be interested in the edible parts of it. So you'll look up the plant name, recipes. It might be the medicinal aspect. So again, plant name, medicinal. And when you start doing this, you start to kind of build up your repertoire of plant knowledge, and every walk just becomes that little bit more interesting. If you want to take it to the next level, there's always tours going on where you'll have a guide who is an expert on these plants telling you some incredible stories. Myself and my girlfriend a little while back did a foraging tour in Howth, and while the bulk of the tour was done in the lovely forests on Howth Head, the start of it was just through a housing estate, and we were shown different plants, things like spurge and chickweed, and told about their history, about their uses. And now every time I go out on a walk and I pass one of those plants, I have a little interaction with it. I know kind of a little bit about it, and I get to kind of enjoy that. And finally, one of the best things that I think you can do to begin to appreciate the wild in a more urban area is to help green your own area, assuming that is that you live in an urban area. There's a huge amount of organisations now which are doing either tidy towns or pocket forests, or even just the kind of regreening of grassy verges or improving your local parkland. Getting involved in these things not only sets up the future to allow people to enjoy your kind of work and to see this nature in action, but I feel like really getting your hands into the soil and really interacting with it allows you to build up so much deeper of an appreciation. And that kind of brings me to the final point of this episode, and that is how we can do better. We can do better by better informing ourselves, by learning more about these plants that have been given this name to them of weed, something that they are not deserving of, how we can begin to appreciate them even more, learn about their history, preserve that history, and pass that on to other people. But it's also about physical actions that can be done to bring a little bit more nature into our everyday lives, to make it so that the only green thing that we see isn't just a plant poking out of a pathway, but instead is a really genuinely beautiful green space. One of the major things is these kind of urban wildlife areas that are popping up. Small little corners that are largely forgotten about. Usually a form of antisocial activity takes place there, whether that just be graffiti or dumping or sometimes something a bit more nefarious, but these areas can be brought back to life. I've seen it plenty of times in areas around me. I've seen it in Dublin city centre, where areas have been completely transformed with just the actions of a few individuals. And I think one of the best ways of doing this is through community gardens. For a recent project in work, I did a lot of research into community gardens, and one that really kind of struck me was, I believe it's called Mud Island. It's in Dublin's northeast inner city, which is an area with a huge history of a lack of investment. And so locals took it upon themselves to take an area that was previously just used for dumping and turn it into something far more beautiful. They've begun to grow their own produce, even open up a farm shop, and they use it as a event space, bringing more people closer to nature and bringing nature closer to them. There's plenty of examples of community gardens or allotments all around Dublin, and whenever you go up, it feels like you're in a completely different universe, one where I suppose nature won and we have allowed it to thrive alongside us instead of just crushing it down for our own advantage. And it doesn't have to be a big space. Mud Island is actually a bit of an outlier. It's on a slightly larger site than usual, but I've seen it in tiny little corners, it's even at the end of cul-de-sacs, just on where the path used to be, transformed into a small little vegetable garden. And one thing that I've seen in a few allotments and community gardens are kind of self-proclaimed weed beds where the soil is left untouched, and instead of neat rows of carrots and potatoes, you have all sorts of things: dandelions, nettles, herb robert, yarrow, even ivy, and you kind of find the use for them instead of putting things in. I saw this firsthand when I went to the allotment with Phoebe, and she showed me around her little vegetable plot. And while there was things that she had planted in there with a kind of a plan of use for them, a lot of the area was just what was already there or what was already around. And like I said, the kind of proof is in the pudding. The chickweed that she had found was then used to kind of help treat my skin. I saw a recent video of hers that was using horsetails to make a solution to improve your hair. So even when we take a more managed approach to kind of cleaning up our environment, like these allotments and community gardens, we can still keep these so-called weeds in mind and use the kind of power that they have and allow them to thrive just as we should. I kind of hate that throughout this episode I've had to use the word weed so much because it's something I don't want to use. I wish that there was a better term for these types of plants. I usually use the word wildflower just because that's what they are. They're the same as anything else. They're the same as an orchid. They're the same as a rare grass or a rare lichen. They are just wildflowers, wild plants, but we've just given them this name, I suppose. And it's been a very conscious thing for myself to try and reframe my mind on them. I try and not to be discouraged when I see weeds growing in a flower bed in an ornamental garden, even though the gardener in me wants to pluck it out. And I hope that after this episode, you too have a little bit more appreciation for the, I suppose, the more wilder wildflowers amongst them. I'm sorry that there's been such a huge delay in episodes lately. I was kind of in my first proper full-time job recently. I was on holidays, and in all honesty, I was a little unmotivated with the podcast, but I think I'm really back in it. I'm really excited for some of the plans that are coming up, and all in all, I'm really happy with kind of how Feet on the Soil is going. If you follow me on my social medias, you probably saw that I had a recent guided walk where we walked around Glenasmole and actually spent a lot of time talking about weeds and the value of them. A lot of things like Herb Robert was a big one throughout, and even about how certain things like a hazel tree can be kind of considered a weed. There's hazel trees growing up in Glenasmole that weren't planted. They're not exactly not wanted, but they're not planned, so technically they're a weed, but who doesn't love hazelnuts? And you also might have seen another new announcement, which is the Feet on the Soil book club. So we'll be meeting on the 28th of this month, September 2025, to talk about an Irish Atlantic rainforest, a fantastic book by Owen Dalton. We're reading it at the moment, and if you'd like to join, the link is in the bio of all my social medias. It's through an app called Book Clubs, and we'll be meeting on Zoom. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. It was a little bit more rambly. I kind of just wanted to talk about weeds a bit. I'm really into wildflowers and their uses, like I said. So maybe I'll do an individual episode for some of the plants that I've mentioned here. And hopefully you can go on a walk now, see something green out the corner of your eye, and be able to appreciate it as something more than something that shouldn't be there. But there's no way that you'll see any nettles, any yarrow, any chickweed, any ivy, any Herb Robert, if you don't try and get outside today.